So I would request our moderators, Dr. Natarajan and Dr. Thomas, to please bring up with the start with the Q&A session for Professor Juan.
Thank you, Neha. Professor Perez-Mercader, that was a incredible talk on which starts from the physics and the mathematics and ends up with the chemistry and the biology. And I'm sure our audience would have appreciated it greatly. It's the kind of science we dream about studying and doing as children when we study science in high school. So thank you very much. We we wanted to ask a few questions and hope that you could spare a few minutes for this. Uh,
Yep.
Yeah. So my first question has to do with the concept of modeling any kind of living systems. The great question that uh, I have seen some debate on is the question of equilibrium. So the term out of equilibrium has been used in your presentation quite frequently. Uh, the first question is whether out of equilibrium is the same thing as non-equilibrium. And the second thing is, what is the rationale for assumption of whether all these phenomena should be taken into equilibrium events or non-equilibrium phenomena?
Yeah, the first part of the question is non-equilibrium. Excuse me, non-equilibrium versus something else which was equivalent. A non-equilibrium is a state of matter or a state of matter and energy in which the system is open. If the system is open, then the system cannot and is receiving materials from the outside, for example, then the system cannot stay in equilibrium. If it is getting impacted from everywhere, the system, if it is in equilibrium, will soon disintegrate, will soon disappear. It will need to react. And that reaction, not only chemical reaction in the case of living systems, but that reaction actually leads to new states which are in most cases metastable, then temporarily in equilibrium, so long as you're feeding energy to the system. And the system then in those new states generates order from energy that it has, and the order will eventually disappear and the system will go into equilibrium. So non-equilibrium is essential for living systems. Living systems are open systems because they need to get things from the outside. They're not closed systems. The second law of thermodynamics only applies to systems which are closed, totally closed. Okay, so an open living system does not follow directly the second law of thermodynamics. Of course, the second law of thermodynamics would operate in closed parts and for a certain length of time, but the system is out of equilibrium because otherwise it cannot do the chemistry, it cannot eat food, it cannot receive energy, etc., etc. So that's the point. Life, and this is the second question, all living systems that we know require that property. All living systems need to be out of equilibrium in order to be able to metabolize, in order to be able to self-reproduce, in order to be able to adapt, and in order to be able to use information.
Thank you, Professor. In my next question had to do with the life cycle of the cells, because we have seen in these slides the modeling of the division events and the multiplication events. So as you know, cells have a life cycle. They grow, they multiply, and then even in physics, there's a concept. It's generation and annihilation. So how do you mathematically model the life cycle of a single cell?
The life cycle of a single cell can be modeled, as you saw, in the computer. You can use those equations that you saw. You can actually make sure that there is you look at the life cycle of a cell from, instead of looking at the details and look at all the phases that we see today, you look at you take what you call top-down approach, which is from the outside in, which is a way of designing computer programs and also a way of doing physics. You look at things without details, and then you go in there. So for the life cycle, going from the beginning to death or disappearance, the life cycle actually what talks about is, as you know very well, is how the system grows, reaches a certain stages in which it is mature enough, and then it reproduces. And then in some cases, bacteria, for example, they can follow many cycles, and then eventually they accumulate so many degradations and so many defects in the molecules that they have inside that they simply, that strain of bacteria disappears, that mother in the strain of bacteria disappears, but the species, this is very important, continues alive. The same can be done in the computer. How do you model? Well, if you look at the questions we wrote, the equations that we wrote are written with first representing information mathematically, then representing metabolism mathematically. To represent information, the handling of information, you need to have a mathematical function that gives rise to some sigmoidal behavior. That's an on-off switch. To represent, for example, metabolism, you need to have something which is autocatalytic inside. Autocatalytic in some very general sense, not in full detail. The full detail of autocatalysis is extremely complicated. But if you look at it from very little detail, which is important, very little detail, then you can actually model it with autocatalysis. Then the systems have to self-reproduce. The self-reproduction of the system is done by requiring something which is called a Turing instability. A Turing instability leads to from one domain to produce other domain, produce copies of it, and that is also implemented by going to cubic equations in the reaction system. And then the adaptation is introduced by actually introducing two feedback loops into the mathematics. The feedback loops into the mathematics are introduced in this system that you see there, are introduced when you impose the mass the chemistry, the rules of chemistry into the system. Okay, that is what actually ended up generating the feedback loop. So it can be modeled, but not in the details. A biologist wants to understand how the chromosome will divide and all that. This is much easier, much simpler than that. In some way, it's as if you were looking at the solar system without getting into the details of the planets. So if you are looking at the solar system without getting into the details of the planets, and you are, for example, Kepler, then you begin to invent, to see that there are laws that are satisfied. Of course, if you don't go to the moons of Jupiter, you will never know that, or if you cannot look at them with the telescope, you could never know that they have volcanoes and so on and so forth, which are the details. Here is equivalent to, well, equivalent, is the same idea of representing something which is very complicated, idealizing it to something which is simple. And that is how we do the modeling without getting into the details.
Thank you, Professor. The next question has to do with the population effects. So in basic physics, it's like we do know that when the population of any singular entity becomes larger and larger, they become subject to ensemble effects. So since you have seen populations grow of these, I'm not sure if protocells is the correct term, but have you also observed in practice ensemble effects?
Yes, we do see that they become families or species. So the population, for example, you take, that's a very beautiful question also. You remember when I spoke about some which had zinc in them, zinc TPP, and others which didn't have zinc TPP. So those are two different populations that we generated. We took a container, we synthesized this one, okay, and we synthesized that one. And we observe this one separately and this one mixed. I mean, separately also. And then we mix them. So there is a new, so this make an ensemble of the one with zinc, for example. And this makes another ensemble, the ones with that zinc. It's a population because as they replicate and they stay alive during a period of time, they are not a single element. They are many elements. They also follow Locke-Volterra type of dynamics, population dynamics, which is very interesting. You know, of course, we don't have time to explain all of that, but then you can mix them. And when you mix them, then you see that these guys go their way. They do their thing. These other guys do their thing. And then they compete for the resources. So you have two ensembles that compete for resources, which is a physics phenomenon, but it's also something which is very well, something that happens in life. It's called the competitive exclusion principle, which means that by competition for resources, shared resources, one species will do away with the other because it eats all the things faster than the other. So yes, the answer is there are ensembles which appear in the form of populations, and the populations are distinguished by their physical-chemical properties, and those ensembles, there you are. So now we are in business.